One of the things that you didn't get 3 decades ago was you didn't get any training in terms of how to supervise PhD students. It was simply, oh, you've got a PhD, so now you can supervise PhD students. But that's what we would refer to as throwing somebody in at the deep end, right? So you're not being taught to swim. You're thrown in at the deep end, and you've got to learn how to supervise PhD students, having not actually done that. 30 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, I wouldn't have dreamt of going and talking to anybody, certainly not outside my university, right? Yeah. I was encouraged by my supervisor to go and talk to his next door neighbor who was also supervising PhD students in Heriot Watt. But I was never talking to people, right, who were something outside that. Because, in those days, you had a supervisor, you may have a second supervisor, although that is something which has developed again more recently.
What is one final advice that you want to talk to, particularly a doctoral researcher now? What is one message that you would like them to remember, particularly after watching your conversation today with me?
Independence. I started off talking about that what we're trying to do is transform students into independent researchers. I think that's the purpose of a doctorate.
Good afternoon, Prof.
Good afternoon, David.
This is the Truth in Research conversation, where we initiate conversations that are very timely and relevant, particularly in shaping the future of early career researchers all over the world. Prof, can you take us back to your time back at Heriot Watt University when you started your career? Tell us about yourself.
That's a very long time ago. Well, thank you for inviting me here. Yes, I got my PhD from Heriot Watt University back in 1994. And then I became a lecturer at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom in civil engineering. But since then, I've actually been with 4 international universities. So, my career started off, as I say, as a lecturer in engineering, and more recently I have moved away from engineering and into international business, and I've taught at postgraduate level in the UK, in the Middle East, and in Malaysia, and now I find myself as an adjunct professor with a university in India. So my career has been really quite international. So half my career has actually been spent away from the UK. So what I can draw on in what we're going to discuss this afternoon, I guess, is experience in teaching and research and supervision of international students from all over. From Africa, from Asia, from North America, South America, Europe. I've supervised students here in the UK from all over the world, and also, of course, having had the experience of working with universities abroad as well. So broad for me, being from the UK. So yeah, so the experience, as I say, mainly at postgraduate level since I've been a professor. So in the last 15 years, increasingly that's the level at which I've been teaching and supervising students. But as a PhD student, so I've seen the PhD from all angles. As a PhD student, as a supervisor, as an internal examiner, as an external examiner. I've also been involved in designing doctoral programs. So I've seen this 360 degrees. So yeah, that's what I'm drawing.
Completely, yes. So looking back at your early career, Prof, I want to ask you, what actually inspired you to pursue academia? Because I want you to know, did you really envision to become a professor?
Yes. I had some experience working in the civil engineering industry and decided that it wasn't for me. I was always interested in research, not so much in teaching, although my father was in education. So my father was a college lecturer, head of department, director of a college at the end of his career. So education was in my blood. Research was something that I got more and more interested in, obviously doing the PhD. And it was really a natural progression for me at that time. And I think for most people that do PhDs, academia is presented to them as that's the way to go. And I think universities like to have people doing PhDs, then going to postdoc, then becoming academics. You know, that's a wonderful progression. But of course, these days, people are doing all sorts of things with their PhD, or not doing anything with their PhD once they've got it. So and of course, a lot of different kinds of PhD. 30 years ago, we didn't have anything such as engineering doctorates or DBAs, or, you know, all of these things have been developing over the 3 decades that I've been involved in postgraduate and doctoral education. But at that time when I started, it was a sort of natural progression. Oh, you've got a PhD, and so therefore you're going to become a lecturer. And if you're becoming a lecturer, then you're on an academic path. So yes, professor is what you will aim to do. And that's how it came about, you know.
All right, okay, so that's a very good one, because a lot of times one of the things that determines the end point is the way you're moving in the trajectory of your career. So looking at our conversation today, we're going to be looking at how great doctoral mentors, how they shape research excellence. Because if you look at out there on LinkedIn and out there online, you see a lot of people are talking about supervision and how the role supervision plays in the outcomes, you know, of maybe somebody who passed through as a PhD candidate. What is the final outcome like? Now, what I want to ask now is, you completed your PhD over 3 decades ago, and what are some of the most valuable lessons, you know, from your doctoral journey that still influences how you mentor a lot of researchers today?
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting. The title that you gave me for this session was Beyond Supervision. The first part of it was beyond supervision. So what is beyond supervision? What can be beyond supervision? Well, then it's how a PhD student becomes independent. So to me, one of the things that I learned from my experience as a PhD student was, if I'm going to be now supervising students, how should I supervise students? What was my experience from my supervisor all that time ago, right? Because one of the things that you didn't get 3 decades ago was you didn't get any training in terms of how to supervise PhD students. It was simply, oh, you've got a PhD, so now you can supervise PhD students. But that's what we would refer to as throwing somebody in at the deep end, right? So you're not being taught to swim. You're thrown in at the deep end, and you've got to learn how to supervise PhD students, having not actually done that. I mean, the same applies for teaching. There was very little training in higher education, certainly in the kind of university that I was in. There was very little training of PhD students to teach. So there was an expectation, oh, you've got a PhD, so you can teach and you can supervise and you can carry out research. Okay, so the learning was on the job. And I think that most people who are supervising PhDs will draw on their own experience of how they were supervised. So if you had a good experience from your supervision, right, then that's fine, and you've had a positive experience. But it's all about learning through the mistakes that you make, as well as the things that work. But for me, the things that I remember, right, were really, and that I think we need to consider very carefully, is that, you know, every PhD is different. Because every piece of research that we do is different. And the students are different, and the supervisors are different, And ultimately, when we get to examination of a PhD, the examiners are all different. So there are lots of variables here, which means that, saying, this is the way to supervise PhDs, right? This is the model, right? This is the framework. Follow this and it will work, right? And that just cannot be, because everybody's different. Every piece of research is different. If we think about all the different disciplines, of course there are generic aspects of a PhD which are the same regardless of discipline. But a PhD in engineering is different from a PhD in science, or a PhD in English, or a PhD in business. So it's very difficult to sort of come up and say, right, this is the way to supervise. But I think what I've come to a point now, certainly within the last 12 months, actually, with what I've been doing through LinkedIn, and just seeing what's going on there in terms of the mentoring, with the coaching, with people talking about the way they're supervising students, is that, the PhD has changed. There are many different types of doctorate now, far more than there were. And so again, that's even more complexity, right? So what I would say, this is just something that I think is important to sort of note. Having looked at what's going on, there are lots of advisors and mentors out there who are not supervising PhDs. But what they are doing is that they're basically saying to students or prospective students, get your PhD fast, right? Here's the quick and easy way of getting your doctorate, right? And that to me is really misleading, right? And I know why they're doing it. This has become a commercial exercise, right? Yeah. And fine, okay, there is a business there, there's a market there, right, for helping, supporting students. One key question is, why do those students want to go to mentors and coaches outside their university system, away from their supervisors? Right? What's gone wrong there? Because 30 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, I wouldn't have dreamt of going and talking to anybody, certainly not outside my university, right? Yeah. I was encouraged by my supervisor to go and talk to his next door neighbor, who was also supervising PhD students in Heriot Watt. But I was never talking to people, right, who were something outside that, because in those days you had a supervisor, you may have a second supervisor, although that is something which has developed again more recently, completely, for quality purposes, whatever. But I was not discouraged in talking to people who would be able to help me in my PhD, but never to the extent of, right, go and spend money on a coach. Right. So that is something different from what my experience was as a PhD student. And I think it's something relatively recent that has developed.
Yeah, I think I like what you said there. You talked about the fact that, a lot of PhD supervisors then were learning on the job, because earlier on, there wasn't really that doctoral training for supervisors. So many people did learn on the job. And looking at the fact that you are somebody that have supervised, a lot of international students, PhD students from all angles, you did mention that. What is one thing that's really transformed you to becoming an effective doctoral research supervisor from this experience?
Well, you'd have to ask my students whether I was an effective doctoral.
Yeah, true, exactly.
So dare I talk about it, but, unfortunately, not all students have a good experience with their supervisors, right? They may not fall out with them. They may not, one day walk out and say, I'll need to change my supervisor. It may not get to that level, but, every supervisor is different. Sure. And I do believe, I don't have any evidence to support what I'm saying, but I do believe that most supervisors have basically learned how to supervise from their supervisors. So if you've had a rotten supervisor, right, who's done things which, then chances are you're going to pass on some of the bad supervision practices. Okay. Now, I don't have any evidence to support that, but I reckon that is the case. So, but if you're asking me, the things that I think are the right things to do after 3 decades, I think it's to recognise, right, that what you're trying to do is to create independent researchers. What you don't want is students who are dependent upon you as a supervisor right up until the submission of the thesis and then actually being in the PhD viva. Right? You want to transform the student, right? From somebody who is dependent on you as a supervisor, telling them basically what to do, right? You want to be transforming your students. So you're basically developing independent researchers who can stand alone, right? Mm-hmm. And but I have changed my opinions about PhDs, because I used to think a PhD was a training in advanced research. Right, so in other words, that it was all about learning the tools and techniques. And if you look at what the advisors online or whatever are doing, they're basically talking about research methodology. And I think PhDs are much more than that. Right, so you've put the title of Beyond Supervision. I talk about going beyond the thesis.
Completely.
The thesis is the end product. It's the evidence that you present about your research, but it's not the whole story by any means. The transformation to being an independent researcher, right, is, to me, psychological. So I'm a big believer in the human-centered approach to supervision, the human-centered approach to research, which basically says, most things that are going to go wrong in your PhD, it's going to be related to the human issues. We've talked about, the relationship with your supervisor, which is key. Right? You've got to have a good relationship with your supervisor from year 1 all the way through to whatever year it is that you are finishing your PhD.
Yes.
But that was one of the things that I really learned from my own experience, and also in terms of supervising students. Year 1, the student is pretty dependent on you to provide the guidance and the support, right? And also the criticism. Right, so you've got to provide that is certainly in the first year. By the final year, the student should be much less dependent on you, far more independent, to be able to stand up to the scrutiny, the criticism of the examiners.
Yeah, true, because that independence is something that is very, very, very important as a researcher who is who is guided under supervision, because once the supervisor is able to make the candidates to be independent, he kind of lets them explore lots of things. He gives them that freedom to show competence. And but looking at the fact that we are examining this title Beyond Supervision, what are some of those attributes that you believe that the supervisor can inject into the students, such that even when they leave they are done with their thesis, or even during their thesis, they can think beyond their dissertation? Because we get to see a lot, just like you mentioned when we started this conversation, a lot of supervisors now, right, in so many academic settings, are more concerned about graduating the students, whether or not they are prepared, or whether or not they have the qualities, or maybe many times bringing in the whole commercial attributes into a PhD program. Now people just want to graduate students so they can admit more and make a lot of money. But what are some of those attributes that you believe that the researcher, the supervisor, the doctoral supervisor now can inject into the student to give them that ability to think beyond their thesis, looking from your experience?
But what you're trying to do as a supervisor is to build critical researchers, right? So you're not, as I say, this thing about the dependent student, right? They're waiting for you to give them the answers. To some extent, you do need to do that. As I say, the role of the supervisor changes. So the attributes that are required changes over time. So in the first year of a PhD, your PhD student doesn't know more than you do. Your PhD student knows probably less than you do about the subject. It should be that way, right? But over that period of time, you've got to try to get your students to become more critical of, the literature. If you're talking about the literature search and review, right? If we start getting into that, the specifics of the process, and to over time get to the point where they can say, this is what my research is about. This is my research. Right? So I think to be able to get your student as quickly as you possibly can to become as critical of, the topic, and of course then the actual piece of research that they're going to do, right? So I think critical thinking is the important thing. I think as supervisors, you've got to challenge, right? Without leaning into sort of bullying. And if I just step back from this little, because students, I think, perceive supervisors as being very harsh, very, very, very tough, when actually what they're doing, they're trying to mold the student into being able to essentially defend the work that they're doing, and also to be able to stand alone. So they're going to stand in front of examiners. The supervisor will not say anything, right? The supervisor will not be there to defend the students. They will be on their own. So that process, that transformation. Okay, so to me, the goal is not about dependency. It's actually about independence. And also what you're trying to do is to get your students to be able to judge. So judgment is very, very important. So yeah, I mean, as I say, I'm a big supporter of the idea of the human-centered approach to supervision and research and all the rest of it. But that doesn't mean that, we're soft. There's a tendency for people to say, oh, well, you're going to be soft on students. That's not, all that business of, and a lot of it is to do with perceptions by students of supervisors who are quite tough, particularly in the early years of a PhD, the early part of a PhD. But it really is to get the students to stand on their own 2 feet. That I think is important. Well, but it's very difficult.
Yeah, true.
You're talking about attributes of or what makes the perfect supervisor. There just isn't one. And yeah.
Yeah, true. Because
sorry, I don't know whether that answers the question.
Yes, I think what many a times I did get your point there, and if you look at the doctoral students, many a times there are some common mistakes that they do make sometimes, that makes supervision difficult. You did acknowledge that some doctoral students sometimes perceive their supervisors to be harsh on them, and tough. More use the word tough. Kind of tough supervision. So, from your experience and from a perspective looking at the vast array of students that you've supervised across different cultures and across different settings internationally, what are some of the mistakes what are these mistakes that you think doctoral students do make, PhD students? What are those mistakes that you think that they do make that makes supervision, maybe unintentionally, they make this mistake unintentionally, that makes it difficult? And how do you think they can
one of the things that I try to do is to have a very open, a conversation, really, more conversation, rather than me saying do that. Right now, a lot of supervisors take a different approach, and basically what they're doing is they're giving the student work to do. So some balance between, the guidance that you give being too rigid about the things that you're telling a student to do, right? And then, but allowing them to come to you with the ideas, but really with a PhD, you want the student to develop your understanding. Well, I mean, that's and they're carrying out new research. They're going to come up with some new ideas or new findings. So you want to create an atmosphere where students feel that they can do that and that they feel comfortable actually communicating with you and saying, this is what I found. But really, the key thing is that the student feels comfortable enough to come to you and say, actually, I haven't done any work. Actually, I've been on holiday for a fortnight.
Yeah, true.
Right? Right, okay. So what's going on, right? Because one of the worst things that happens is that students disappear. Yeah, if you ask any supervisors, right, in many situations, a student will disappear on you. Where are they? Why have they done this? What's going on? Are there personal problems, right? And if you've got that open dialogue, open communication relationship with the student from day one, then they will feel, less intimidated. There's a power thing here, right? Because here is this lecturer or professor or whatever, and you're a student just setting out, and it's like, can I speak to my supervisor on a level? Right? Do I feel comfortable actually saying I'm in trouble here? Right now, I had those difficulties myself as a student, so I know what that was like. Right, but my relationship with my supervisor was good, and I could go and talk to him and say, "Look, I actually haven't done any work," and so then he would talk me into, doing something, getting back, so it's things like that. So to me, again, if you come back to the attributes, having an open communication and a good relationship with your student, right? That's not being soft, because if you can understand what's going on in your student's life, which may be distracting them, which may be taking them away from what they're meant to be doing in the time that they've got, right? Because you've always got that time management thing, right? So I'm not against the idea of attempting to project manage your PhD, right? That you've got some kind of structure, some kind of planning. That's very important. But the human issues will be the thing that will distract the student, right? So they might have a fantastic plan that they've agreed with you as the supervisor, but things will happen. A PhD is a long period to be working on a single project, and most students have not had that experience before. So it's
agree.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Completely agree, and I think some of these mistakes are some of what they could better manage, and that's why building.
What is your own experience? Can I ask you, what is your experience? Do you mind if I ask you?
Okay, well, I think sure. From my own perspective, I feel like many students fail to build relationships with their supervisor, and just like you mentioned, which is something I've seen across here, many times when you look at PhD students, they cannot have this idea that their supervisor is doing too much, right? And when they are working, they get not to communicate clearly in details to their supervisor, and that's actually a mistake. So that's one mistake they do make. And also I also feel that PhD students are also always locked in into their own. What do I mean by that? Let's say sometimes a task is being given to them these days. Now, although PhD is really changing now these days, when a task is being given to them, they don't always complete that task looking at how their supervisor expects the direction of that task to be. And that's why you get to see supervisor to student, relationships breaking down and all of that. I believe the relationship and the approach to tasks is one of the problems so many PhD students do have.
But you mentioned that, the cultural aspects. And different students coming from different backgrounds, different nationalities, different cultures, they work in different ways. And the way that they treat their teacher, because that's who they think you are. Right? You're like my teacher. And therefore, they have a lot of respect. And perhaps also, they put you a little bit up on a pedestal. You're up on a higher level, right? And that actually, unfortunately, gets in the way of good research.
True.
And a good relationship. It's very difficult, right, for then you to progress. So, again, it's about how do we adapt our approaches to supervision given different types of students from different backgrounds. So think of all the variables here, different types of PhD with different requirements, different students with different backgrounds. Right? And it may not be anything to do with their culture. It may be just that they're that type of person who, for example, they don't need supervision. What about the students that think they don't need it? No, they think they don't need supervision. They may not need supervision. They may be really great. They can go out there and they do. But as a supervisor, you have a responsibility, right, because of the institution that you're working for, right? For one thing, but also just ethically, as a human supervisor, you have a responsibility to know what your student is actually doing,
Completely.
right? And to be involved in it, to be actively involved in the research.
True. I think the next thing I was going to say is, if every doctoral supervisor around the world were listening to this particular conversation today, what is one practice that you're going to encourage them to adopt that could significantly improve the research experience for their students?
I think that fundamentally, it's got to be about open communication. I think it's got to be what we've just talked about, right? Because I think that really, if you've got open communication and you build a good relationship with your student, you know who they are, you know what their personality is like, that will take you through the whole of the process. And because, as I say, it's a long process compared with any other project that the students will have done. And if I think about part-time students, think about the students who are working in industry, right? And again, all the things that can go wrong with part-time doctoral studies. I mean, I had a PhD student where it took 10 years. It was 10 years, right? And that student had moved job 2 or 3 times. And every time they moved job, they lost time in their PhD and they had to restart. We almost had to go back to basics every time. And by the end of that period, the data that had been collected was considered to be old data. So the challenge is, right, we tend to think about full-time PhDs, full-time doctorates, but actually, increasingly, I think we're going to find people who are not doing PhDs and doctorates full time. They'll be doing it part time. Doing doctorates online. Again, there are lots of concerns there. Lots of different aspects of that, challenges. But to me, if you know the people who you are supervising, then I think that is absolutely fundamental. To know your students, right? So that really would be what I would put as the most important thing. I mentioned project managing your PhD, but that is, you get. So there's the technical side of a PhD. As a supervisor, you should understand the technical side, how to put together a thesis. But that's only, I don't know, I was going to say 50%. I don't think it's 50%. I haven't quite worked out how much is about the thesis and how much is all this other psychological stuff, which really goes into the supervision of a PhD.
Completely. It should be more. It should be beyond the thesis entirely. And looking at what you said, I believe that when a supervisor and the doctoral researcher builds open communication, you rarely see doctoral students having the ability to have honest conversations with their supervisor, and also the relationships that get to extend beyond the walls of supervision. And from some of the very useful insights that you've shared here, it kind of points that beyond supervision, to build that excellence beyond supervision, it requires the supervisor having very good open communication skills that allows a doctoral researcher to walk up to you and open up to you on what they want.
David, the second line, beyond supervision, the second line in the title you sent me was how great doctoral mentors shape research excellence. Well, if you've created independent researchers, then that will shape research excellence. Right? Exactly. If you've developed critical thinkers, if you've got a research student that can judge what's good and bad, right, and can work out where the real gaps are in the research and what they've got to do. So I think that's what we're talking about there. But the other thing that we haven't talked about, which I think is important, your supervisor knows, because they've gone through a PhD themselves and probably have supervised several PhDs before they are supervising you, they've gone through the process of examination. And keeping in mind right the way through the doctorate that, hey, you're going to be presenting this to examiners. You won't probably know who they are, right? They're going to be experts in the field, right? Keeping in mind that and thinking about, well, what are the examiner's expectations? As a supervisor, right, you should have an insight into that because you've supervised others. You know external examiners. You've probably been an external examiner yourself, or at least an internal examiner. So you know the examination process. So if we're talking about the thesis and presentation of it and defense of it, right, that's where you're aiming.
Completely.
Right. So for me, right from day one, right, I would be saying, well, we know pretty much what examiners are looking for. Right. We can't say specifically what they'll be looking for in your work because we don't know what your work is going to be. But contribution. This is the thing I talk about, Neely, and it obviously becomes boring. Contribution to knowledge is the absolute original contribution to knowledge is what a thesis has got to get across, right? And I know it's boring to keep talking about it, but that's what it's important about. No, it's absolutely essential.
Very
so
important.
A supervisor has got to be talking about that from day one to whenever it is you're then presenting your thesis. So to me, that's really important. But examiners, from an examiner's perspective, what are examiners looking for? And, you could spend a whole session, right, just talking about that. And I've just examined a PhD in the last couple of weeks. What you get as an examiner, you don't know the student. You probably don't know the supervisor. You might, but you probably won't. And so all you've got to work on is the thesis that is presented. So that it's beyond the supervisor, right? Once you get the thesis presented to examiners, that's where and so what you're doing is you're looking at the thesis, then you meet the student, either in person or online, right? And you then are able to listen to the student presenting their thesis, presenting the evidence, right? And, but really, as an examiner, you don't know what's gone into it. And I said to the student who we were examining just a couple of weeks ago, I said, I don't know the extent of the amount of work and the effort and the personal sacrifice that you have put in to produce that work. There it is. That's it. Right? I didn't know how long they'd taken to produce that doctorate. It might have been 2 years. It might have been 10 years. Right? You've got no idea. So all you're doing initially is examining what's on paper. So, of course, it's important that the supervisor is able to project manage and get to the point where that thesis is to the level. But then the student's got to stand there or speak to the thesis. So, as a supervisor, you've got to coach the student as best you can. But at the end of the day, the student is standing there alone. Right? And so the product is the thesis and the student. The student is part of that product, right? And if they can't defend themselves, then that's where we have difficulties. So does that sort of add to? Does that add to what we're talking about?
Yeah, it does add. It does. I think there's also another thing we need to look at, which is trust, because trust is a recurring theme that happens in supervision. And how do you think supervisors and doctoral students can build relationships that encourage that honest conversation that we are talking about? Because everything really stems up from here. Beyond supervision, if you want to shape good researchers, you want to produce researchers that can show excellence, how trust is very real, is a very important theme here. So how do you think they can shape that relationship that would encourage your students that walk up to you now, Chris, and they are honest to you, they can, they show resilience, and of course, which leads to research excellence. So how do you think they can build that, you can build that relationship that will shape that honest conversation?
Yeah, again, it's the open communication, right? If there's open communication and honesty, and a supervisor's got to be honest with the student, and the student's got to be honest with the supervisor, and that often doesn't happen. But I mean, if you take a case of, if you know the student, because the student's done their degree, they've done their masters, and now they're doing their PhD, and you actually have known the student, which that's happened to me, where you've actually known the student over a number of years, or they've at least been in the same institution. Well, that's a lot easier than obviously when a student comes in, right? They apply to a university, they get accepted, and they probably contacted you by email or something as a prospective supervisor, but you don't know them at all. So the first day that you talk to them, a bit like this situation, David, where I don't know you. I've never met you personally. This is the first time that we've actually talked here, right? And we didn't know whether we would be able to conduct this
completely
in the way that we have, right? Which has gone quite well so far, right? But
completely
this is the situation that you're in. You don't know, so it takes time. So building trust, right, is I like the topic. I'm very pleased that you've brought this in, because I think, again, a fundamental thing that we need is trust.
Yeah, of course.
And of course, it will change over time. The trust thing will change over time.
Yeah. So, Chris, looking at all that you've done, what is one mistake that you feel like that you might have made, or the supervisors do make, doctoral researchers, that's kind of influences how researchers
putting me on the spot. This isn't a job interview. Yes. Tell me about your weaknesses. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Well, no, of course, many mistakes over the years, but again, you'd have to talk to my students, right, to find out what they actually thought about. And by no means, when I'm talking about PhDs and supervision and how students should behave, how supervisors should behave, how examiners should behave, right? I'm not perfect. I wasn't a perfect student. I'm not a perfect supervisor, not a perfect examiner, for all sorts of different reasons. But I think, what we haven't talked about, which is important, is the pressure that supervisors are under, right? Students are under pressure to perform, but supervisors in their academic careers are under pressure to perform. And there's a lot of pressure from academics and supervisors, which is suddenly passed on to their students, right? So the pressure to publish, right? The pressure to get funding for research, right? There's a lot of pressure on academics and supervisors. So let's not forget that, because otherwise anybody watching this later on who are supervisors in universities will say, yeah, but I haven't got time. I'm teaching so much, right? I've got to also publish, right? I've got to do all this administration, right? Oh, and then I've got these PhD students, right? So the balancing act that we have to do as academics, right? And of course, when I've gone on to conferences and my students have been trying to get access to me, to contact me, and I've been away, right? And so I'm sure that sometimes I've been delayed in providing feedback to my students. Of course, that's a weakness, but let's try and understand why that. It's not because I'm lazy. It's not. Yeah, I'm not sitting on a beach somewhere, right? It's because I am under pressure to perform. So I think we need to appreciate that. There's a tendency to be very one-sided in all of this and to say, oh, poor students. Right. Well, what about the poor supervisors? What pressure are they under? I mean, again, that's another topic for another day, kind of thing.
Completely. True.
But clearly, we put students under pressure to publish. Right. Yes. That will be one of the things that we are cracking the whip. Right. You're going to produce how many papers?
Yeah.
And why? Yeah,
of course. Yeah, that's pressure for publication is something that is real, and I think maybe that's what we're going to talk about sometime. The quality of publication and some publication practices that we see amongst supervisors and doctoral researchers, which we really need to go into, particularly in details, to just explore the nuances of what is happening there.
So that wasn't something that we faced 30 years ago.
True,
we didn't have no pressure. There was no pressure for me to publish anything while I was doing my PhD. So what we had to do was produce our PhD, get our doctorate, and then start publishing. Right? Because you've got the data. And in fact, my supervisor said to me, you should not be publishing your data yet until you've actually got the PhD, you've been examined, right? You've been awarded the doctorate, right? Because as we know, with the thesis, it's got to be revised. Mine had to be revised. I had a certain amount of time to work on it, to get it up to scratch. So there was no way that we were going to be published. Now it's a different game now.
True.
We almost start in our heads, we've got to publish papers, but we haven't done the research yet.
Of course.
What's the quality of the data that we've got, right? So anyway, this is a different world.
Yes, completely. Of course, we'll definitely explore that. I'm sure we'll definitely explore that on a special conversation. So, Chris, looking at millions of researchers who are actually watching this, as much as we've explored insights on beyond supervision and how it can provide excellence out there. What do you think? What is one final advice that you want to talk to, particularly a doctoral researcher now who is maybe in a low and middle income country context, who is starting their career, or maybe who is at the first year of their PhD? What is that one message that you would like them to remember, particularly after watching your conversation today with me?
Well, there are a number of things that I think we can say at the end of what we've talked about. And by the way, we haven't mentioned AI, because that is a huge challenge now for everybody. So we haven't talked about that today, but I'm mentioning it because otherwise somebody will say, what about the issues to do with AI, right? But I'm not going to go there. Anyway, independence. I started off talking about that. What we're trying to do is transform students into independent researchers. I think that's the purpose of a doctorate, right? I think there's a hidden psychological journey that students go on. And part of what we need to do as supervisors is support our students through the psychology of the PhD. It's not easy, it's hard. And that's why there's not much talk about that, right? I think we've got to, as supervisors, what we have to do is balance challenging students, disciplining students with support. Okay. I think we need to keep in mind always the examiner's perspective. So in everything that we're doing in our research, particularly as we're getting towards the end of it and we're saying we're now going to present the evidence in a thesis, we've got to keep in mind what we think examiners are looking for. And obviously the big thing is original contribution to knowledge. So that's something we need to focus on. We're not just talking about transmitting knowledge. It's about demonstrating judgment. Okay, and if we're thinking about research excellence, which is part of what the title of this, that research excellence is like as the result of everything that we've talked about. So the relationship with the supervisor, right, the project managing of the technical side of the PhD, the trust that we've got to build. So there's also a culture in university, within the institution. Saying university may not be. It's whatever institution we're talking about has its own culture, right? And some are more research orientated than others. Some have a longer history of research and PhDs than others, right? So we need to take that into consideration. So for me, the greatest supervisors, right, they're not great because of the fantastic research they've done. Right? They're great because of all the researchers that they've produced themselves. Right? So I'm now a great grandfather because I've supervised and those students have got their PhDs and become academics and they're supervising students who are also supervising students. So see what I'm saying? This is the thing that so really years later, after you've done your PhD, right, you forget all the business of, putting together the thesis, all the revisions that you had to do. Yeah, maybe you didn't get through your PhD without some major rewriting. You'll have forgotten all of that, right? But you've become an independent researcher. You can carry out more advanced research. So to me, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about excellence in research and in supervision.
Yeah, completely, Chris. I must say, this conversation with you is really an eye-opener, particularly for doctoral researchers out there, and also supervisors who are definitely going to be watching this conversation. In short, I must say that this conversation is much more going to be broadened because there are a lot of aspects that we will definitely, I'm sure I'm definitely going to be having you again, which we're going to be discussing, particularly looking at artificial intelligence in research and some of the limitations that are actually coming out there. I just want to keep that for another conversation, and then also other intricacies that we're also going to be exploring in the future. And I just want to really thank you for some of the very massive insights that you've shared, particularly when you talk about open communication. So if you're somebody out there and you're listening to this, as a supervisor, you must make sure you abide by open communication. You communicate clearly to your students, and when you communicate clearly to them, it kind of gives you it gives the doctoral researchers the ability to also respond, and in turn, this is something that now affects both the quality of the dissertation and beyond beyond that particular dissertation or thesis. It kind of shapes how they also react to other things, because the whole idea of supervision and research is that we want to learn how, as researchers, we can independently conduct an experiment, produce an evidence, and also when we graduate, we also continue in industry and sometimes refer back to the institution if there is need for that particular interaction and communication. So I really want to thank you very much for also hammering more on relationship building, why relationship is something that is really very imperative, particularly in guiding researchers, doctoral researchers, and why supervisors should also see that their students are very independent. I want to say a very big thank you, and I'm sure this is an episode that is really going to be very useful to our listeners, and it's going to be shared widely to them. Right. Thank you very much. If there's any last thing you want to leave with us before we...
Well, no, so thank you, David, for the introduction again, for the invitation to come and speak, right? But also you mentioned trust. Right. And It's something that I'm really interested in. How do we build the trust? Because I think, if you're talking about the open communication, all the rest of it, that's what that's what we've got to try to encourage. Okay, but generally, you won't get this kind of conversation, right? What you will get is advice on research methods. You'll get advice on how to write your introduction, your literature review, your research methodology chapter, and all these things, right? All very important stuff, but that's the technical PhD.
Yes.
And a lot of what we're talking about, if you're talking about trust, communication, the psychology, right? The human aspects of the PhD, right? This is what I think, it's quite unique about what you are doing here.
Completely.
So thanks very much for inviting me here. So
thank you very much for your time.
All right, thanks, David. Yeah, I hope to talk to you again. I'm
Yes.
sure we can
Sure.
build this.
Sure. Yeah.
All right.